Existing within the daily rhythm of human society involves a constant exchange of dialogue, labor, and shared environments, where even the quietest moments hold weight. Nevertheless, it is a frequent occurrence to depart from these social exchanges feeling perplexed, misinterpreted, or burdened by a subtle sense of discomfort. You might find yourself re-examining spoken words within your mind, questioning the sudden shifts in someone's demeanor or sensing an unspoken tension that remains difficult to identify. This exploration commences with the challenging reality that many individuals choose to ignore. Your social difficulties do not stem from a lack of mental capacity. Rather, you encounter obstacles because the true nature of human conduct is seldom transparent. People rarely articulate their genuine intentions, often lack awareness of their own internal states, and almost never operate through cold rationality. Instead, they are propelled by hidden anxieties, unfulfilled desires, historical traumas, and the fragile public personas they fight to preserve. Without the proper framework to identify these undercurrents, you are essentially attempting to navigate the complexities of human nature with an obsolete set of instruments. Furthermore, most of us were conditioned to prioritize verbal communication, yet spoken language represents merely the topmost crust of reality. Beneath the dialogue exists a complex world of hidden motivations, personal vulnerabilities, hierarchies of influence, and internal provocations. This explains why individuals characterized by high intelligence and genuine kindness frequently find themselves exploited, misjudged, or mentally exhausted. This outcome is not a reflection of fragility, but rather a result of the false assumption that others possess an equal level of self-reflection. You likely anticipate truthfulness where there is actually terror, or stability where there is internal chaos. Over time, these fundamental miscalculations dictate the trajectory of your existence. You might place your confidence in unreliable figures, over-explain your actions to those who won't listen, or respond with volatility instead of insight. Authentic interpersonal wisdom is not a pursuit of emotional detachment, nor is it a strategy for dominance or psychological manipulation. It is something much more grounded and influential, the capacity to observe reality without sacrificing your empathy, to interpret conduct without internalizing it as a personal affront, and to recognize recurring themes without falling into bitterness. Whereas many guides focus on superficial tactics, this study offers a different path toward internal equilibrium. You will not be asked to memorize artificial movements or learn to steer conversations through deceit. Instead, you will gain an understanding of how human actions function on a subconscious and delicate level. You will uncover why warmth can instantly turn into coldness, how a person can project a smile while harboring deep-seated bitterness, and how the balance of influence can tilt without a single audible word. Most crucially, you will acquire the skills to govern your own psychological responses, as the most significant edge in any social encounter belongs to the individual who remains internally anchored. This is not about cataloging others for the sake of control, but rather about liberating yourself from the exhaustion of emotional instability and the doubt that clouds your natural instincts. Eventually, you will move beyond labeling others through simple binaries of good or bad. Instead, you will perceive them as intricate, motivated, and frequently unaware of their own drivers. Within that newfound perspective, you will discover a profound sense of composure and a quiet self-assurance that no longer seeks external approval. Hence, we find ourselves at the gateway of understanding the primary machinery that drives all human interaction. Most people operate under the illusion that they comprehend the logic behind someone's actions, accepting verbal justifications without question. However, the roots of conduct are not found in deliberate thought, but in the instinct for emotional preservation. Long before a person articulates a thought, their internal biological system has already categorized an environment as either a sanctuary or a hazard. Every subsequent behavior is merely a strategy to stabilize that internal environment. This is the concealed engine of our species. People do not debate to establish truth, but to defend their concept of self. They do not pull away because of a lack of concern, but because the act of connection feels like a threat to their safety. Influence is often sought not out of a sense of strength, but because of a hidden feeling of inadequacy. Once you embrace this perspective, the external world becomes far less chaotic and far more foreseeable. You begin to realize that most actions are not directed at you personally. They are desperate attempts to avoid experiencing shame, insignificance, or a loss of autonomy. Consequently, if you observe with precision, a distinct pattern emerges where individuals will go to extreme lengths to bypass these uncomfortable internal states. They will substitute intellectual arguments for genuine feeling, utilize humor to mask their terror, or adopt an air of dominance to hide their underlying fragility. What often appears as a display of strength is actually a form of protective casing, and what seems like coldness is frequently a sign of mental fatigue. Arrogance is often nothing more than deep-seated doubt wearing a more aggressive disguise. This is why focusing exclusively on what is said will inevitably lead you astray. Words are carefully selected and polished, whereas instinctive behavior remains raw and telling. A person may claim to cherish transparency, yet they will often react with hostility toward the truth when it threatens the narrative they have constructed about themselves. By recognizing these patterns, you start to see the world as it truly is, allowing you to move through life with a calm authority that originates from within. They may profess a desire for constructive criticism, yet they instantly withdraw or become distant the moment such feedback challenges their core sense of self. They might insist they remain composed even while their physical posture reveals they are bracing for a psychological impact. This internal machinery does not communicate through formal language. Rather, it expresses itself through consistent behavioral themes. One must pay close attention to what individuals are perpetually shielding, what topics they habitually circumvent, and the specific moments where their emotional energy becomes rigid. An individual who resorts to hostility when their views are interrogated is not protecting a logical conclusion, they are safeguarding their very identity. Similarly, the person who provides excessive justifications for their actions is not seeking to be thorough, but is instead searching for a sense of psychological security. Those who require unwavering validation are not projecting self-assurance, but are actually attempting to manage a deep-seated apprehension. It is vital to view these actions not as moral failings, but as neutral observations. Once you transition from judging conduct to deciphering it, your interpersonal experiences lose their volatile emotional weight. You move away from asking why someone behaves so poorly and begin to identify exactly what they are attempting to protect. This single shift in perspective can prevent years of internal turmoil, for when you misinterpret a defensive mechanism as a deliberate intention, you respond with personal hurt. You end up attempting to resolve issues that were never fundamentally about you, whereas recognizing the underlying engine allows you to maintain a healthy distance. You learn to respond with poise rather than reacting with impulse, prioritizing personal lucidity over unnecessary conflict, and thereby preserving your vital energy. Furthermore, we must examine how frequently individuals claim to yearn for deep connection, only to undermine that very closeness the moment it begins to materialize. This sabotage does not occur because they lack a desire for intimacy, but because such proximity poses a direct threat to their meticulously built internal fortifications. For some, genuine closeness highlights a perceived sense of inadequacy. For others, it carries the terrifying risk of eventual desertion. For many, it triggers ancient emotional scars that they have survived only by ignoring. Consequently, they manufacture distance, redirect conversations, resort to criticism, or attempt to exert control, often wondering later why they remain isolated. Grasping this reality does not imply that you should tolerate or excuse damaging behavior. Instead, it ensures that you are no longer bewildered by it. You develop the capacity to distinguish between an explanation and a justification. While a reason clarifies why an action occurred, it does not render that action permissible. True social wisdom begins here, in the ability to acknowledge these dual truths without falling into the traps of constant resentment or blind innocence. Another fundamental realization regarding this hidden engine is that human beings are far more motivated by the avoidance of distress than by the pursuit of personal evolution. Growth necessitates a degree of discomfort that feels threatening, whereas familiar pain provides a perverse sense of stability. Thus, many people subconsciously opt for what is known over what is beneficial, remaining in restrictive roles or clinging to outdated identities. They repeat cycles that diminish their potential not because they find pleasure in misery, but because the unknown feels more dangerous than the suffering they already understand. This explains why logical appeals so frequently fail to alter human conduct. You can present facts, offer rational arguments, and provide undeniable evidence, yet if the proposed change compromises emotional security, the internal engine will bypass logic every single time. Attempting to persuade others often results in frustration because you are addressing the conscious intellect while the true driver resides much deeper. When you accept this, you cease squandering your energy on debating someone's defenses. Instead, you become an observer, noticing the subtle shifts in vocal tone, the moment humor turns into a weapon, or the heavy weight of a sudden silence. These are not coincidental occurrences, they are vital indicators, and the more dispassionately you witness them, the more authority you gain, not as a means of controlling others, but as a way of mastering yourself. Hence, we find that the most prevalent error in social dynamics is the desperate urge to be understood before making an effort to truly understand. People often rush to justify their emotions or seek validation from those who are fundamentally incapable of providing it. Sophisticated social intelligence reverses this sequence. First, you observe the reality of the situation. And only then do you determine your course of action. You decide the appropriate level of proximity, how much of your inner life to reveal, and whether to participate or withdraw, all while remaining free of bitterness. This represents a serene form of confidence born from an intimate knowledge of the forces driving behavior beneath the surface. As you proceed through these insights, keep this foundational principle in mind. Every human action is an attempt to regulate an internal emotional state, and all else is merely superficial ornamentation. When you stop being captivated by the external display, you start to perceive the actual machinery at work. Once the gears are visible, human behavior becomes far less enigmatic and significantly less personal. This path is not about cultivating a cold detachment, but about achieving a profound clarity. It is this very clarity that enables you to maintain compassion for the human condition without ever betraying your own well-being, which is precisely where authentic social intelligence takes root. Within the second chapter, we explore the nuanced reality of why individuals resort to falsehoods even in the absence of a malicious agenda. When the concept of dishonesty arises, most people envision a calculated act of manipulation or a deliberate scheme to deceive. However, the vast majority of untruths are not premeditated but are instead emotional reflexes. Many people engage in deception long before they consciously decide to do so, primarily because the unvarnished truth poses a threat to a vulnerable part of their internal world. Frequently, you are not the primary target of the lie, rather, the individual is lying to themselves. Human beings possess a remarkable capacity to warp their perception of reality to preserve a consistent self-image. This distortion seldom manifests as a blatant fabrication. Instead, it appears as selective recollection, softened terminology, or narratives that possess just enough factual weight to remain plausible. This explains why presenting someone with objective evidence frequently results in failure. Facts can jeopardize one's sense of identity, and when that core is threatened, the internal engine of preservation takes command. Most deceptions are not intended to conceal data, but to safeguard a specific internal persona, one of being capable, compassionate, faithful, brilliant, or in command. When the external world contradicts this persona, the psyche recalibrates the narrative. A person rarely admits to a failure. Instead, they claim the environment was biased. They do not concede to causing pain. They suggest the other party is overly sensitive. They do not confess ignorance. They claim the situation is unnecessarily complex. These are not always intentional maneuvers, but are psychological shortcuts utilized to bypass the agony of self-confrontation. Furthermore, adopting this perspective fundamentally alters how one interprets dishonesty, as you cease viewing lies as personal transgressions and begin to recognize them as indicators of internal friction. While this does not render the lies harmless, it acknowledges them as a deeply human phenomenon. One of the most prevalent expressions of subconscious deception is the act of over-explanation. When an individual provides an excessive amount of detail, repeats their points, or offers unprompted justifications, they are frequently attempting to persuade their own mind as much as yours. Authentic clarity is naturally concise, whereas defensiveness tends to be wordy and elaborate. Another significant indicator is emotional discrepancy, a situation where someone claims to be at peace while their vocal tone becomes strained, or insists they are indifferent while their actions suggest an obsession. They might offer verbal agreement, while their physical posture suggests withdrawal. These contradictions are not accidental. They are the cracks between what an individual desires to believe and what they are actually experiencing. While the body may not always communicate with surgical precision, it consistently signals the presence of internal conflict. Consequently, social intelligence does not demand that you operate as a forensic investigator of lies. It simply requires you to detect misalignment. True alignment feels stable and composed, whereas a lack of harmony feels strained, overly prepared, or emotionally vacant. Hence, we find it essential to make a critical distinction. Anxiety is not synonymous with dishonesty. Many individuals are nervous while speaking the truth, just as some are remarkably poised while being deceptive. Your objective is not to categorize people based on isolated incidents, but to observe recurring themes over a duration of time, as the truth eventually manifests through consistency rather than brief moments. Another driver of unconscious lying is the dread of consequences, which are often internal rather than external. Acknowledging a difficult truth might compel someone to view themselves in a radically different light, and that internal audit feels intolerable. As a result, they diminish the importance of events, reconstruct the narrative, or rationalize their behavior with phrases suggesting they were misunderstood or that the events transpired differently. In many instances, they genuinely believe their own revised version of history. The human mind does not function as a neutral witness to our lives. It operates as a dedicated legal advocate, perpetually defending the integrity of the self against any perceived threat. Consequently, engaging in a debate over the factual accuracy of a narrative is frequently a fruitless endeavor. You are attempting to apply logic to a situation where the other party is merely attempting to survive emotionally. Social intelligence involves recognizing the precise moment to cease demanding a confession and instead begin establishing your own personal boundaries. You do not require another person to validate a lie for that lie to be a reality, nor do you need their concurrence to trust your own instincts. One of the most detrimental cycles is waiting for transparency from an individual who cannot psychologically afford to be honest. You might wait, offer explanations, or provide repeated opportunities for change, yet the internal engine continues to revise the history to suit its needs. Genuine lucidity arrives when you accept that if the truth jeopardizes a person's identity, that truth will be bypassed, not out of malice, but through instinct. This realization liberates you from a perpetual state of uncertainty. You stop questioning why they refuse to be truthful and start identifying what specific reality they are shielding themselves from. From this point, your own conduct shifts. You cease oversharing your vulnerabilities, you stop engaging in impulsive confrontations, and you stop demanding emotional maturity from sources that cannot provide it. Instead, you prioritize the observation of actions, for while verbal language is flexible, behavior requires a significant investment of energy. An individual may profess a deep commitment, while habitually shirking duty. They may claim to care while consistently infringing upon your boundaries. Or they may vow to evolve while defending the very habits that require adjustment. Conduct is the dialect that the subconscious cannot entirely suppress, and over a sufficient duration, it reveals every necessary truth. Furthermore, the development of social intelligence does not foster a sense of paranoia. Rather, it cultivates a refined sense of selectivity. You learn to discern when to pay attention, when to withdraw, when to place your trust, and when to simply acknowledge reality without a trace of bitterness. Critically, you also learn to apply this analytical lens to your own interior life, identifying the most significant deceptions, the ones you tell yourself. You recognize the moments you claim to be content while feeling diminished, or the narratives you construct to avoid necessary discomfort. Mastering this level of awareness demands a profound type of courage. The bravery to see clearly without clutching to soothing but false stories. When you can exist within the truth without being crushed by it, you no longer require the crutch of deception, whether it originates from yourself or others. This internal integrity becomes your primary social asset because individuals grounded in truth are no longer easily disoriented. They do not pursue endless explanations or plead for clarity. They observe the recurring themes, reach a decision, and advance with a quiet resolve. This is not a form of coldness, but a manifestation of self-respect. Once you develop this quality, dishonesty loses its influence over you, not because it ceases to exist, but because you are no longer reliant on illusions to maintain your sense of safety. Hence, we transition into the physiological realm of communication, the silent dialogue of the human form. Long before a single word is articulated, the body has already broadcasted its message. Every interpersonal encounter commences at a level far more profound than spoken language, manifesting through physical tension, spatial distance, and the rhythm of movement. This explains why you can sense a discordance in a conversation even when the dialogue remains courteous and rational. Your nervous system detects the discrepancy before your conscious mind can formulate an explanation. Body language is frequently misinterpreted as a series of static definitions, such as crossed arms signifying defensiveness, but this robotic interpretation misses the underlying essence. The body is not a cipher to be solved with a manual. It is a direct mirror of a person's internal state, and those states are perpetually shifting. An individual does not consciously decide to contract their muscles. They are responding to an environment that feels hazardous, uncertain, or emotionally volatile. Therefore, interpreting physical signals requires active presence rather than rote memorization. The most dependable indicators are not specific gestures, but rather the overall themes of energy. Whereas many focus on minor details, three primary elements carry more weight than any isolated motion: tension, proximity, and tempo. Tension serves as a mirror for internal resistance, proximity reveals the perceived level of safety, and tempo reflects emotional synchronicity. When a person feels genuinely comfortable, their movements are efficient, their respiration is consistent, and their gestures possess a natural fluidity. Conversely, when a person feels under scrutiny or threatened, the body readies itself in subtle ways. The shoulders may rise, the jaw may become rigid, and movements often become either stiff or artificially theatrical. It is crucial to remember that these signs do not automatically indicate deception. This is where many observers falter. Physical anxiety is not synonymous with dishonesty, and discomfort is not a direct indicator of guilt. Quite often, the body is simply reacting to the pressure of the moment rather than a lack of integrity. By observing these patterns over time, you gain a deeper understanding of the unspoken narrative, allowing you to navigate the world with a steadier hand and a clearer mind. Sophisticated social observation moves away from rigid labeling and instead focuses on a more profound inquiry. What is the current internal state of this individual? For instance, someone who avoids direct gaze might be battling shyness, feeling overstimulated, or perhaps they are lost in deep reflection. Conversely, an individual who maintains unwavering eye contact could be projecting authentic self-assurance, or attempting to establish a hierarchy of control. In these moments, the surrounding context is far more significant than the specific gesture itself. This is why the concept of tempo is so incredibly revealing. When two individuals are emotionally synchronized, their natural rhythms begin to align. The speed of their speech matches, pauses feel peaceful rather than awkward, and interruptions are virtually non-existent. When this harmony is absent, the rhythm fractures. You might find one person rushing their sentences while the other slows down significantly, or one person filling every silence with anxious chatter while the other retreats into themselves. You can often perceive this lack of coordination long before you can logically justify it. Furthermore, people unconsciously calibrate their physical proximity based on their sense of security. When safety is felt, closeness is permitted. When it is not, a person will instinctively create distance by leaning away, angling their body, or placing objects between themselves and others. These are not acts of personal rejection, but rather methods of internal regulation. The most telling data is not how close someone stands initially, but how that distance fluctuates over time, as sudden shifts often mirror a change in their internal comfort level. Furthermore, one of the most frequently ignored indicators of a person's state is the presence of stillness. A truly composed and anchored individual does not feel the necessity for constant motion. They aren't performing a sense of safety because they are already experiencing it. In stark contrast, excessive movement, such as rhythmic tapping, fidgeting, or overly theatrical gesturing, often serves as a broadcast for internal turbulence. It is vital to view this as neutral information rather than a moral assessment. The primary risk occurs when people interpret these physical cues without emotional intelligence. They jump to conclusions, apply labels, and react prematurely. True interpersonal wisdom involves slowing down and identifying clusters of signals rather than isolated movements. Most importantly, this process must include a focus on your own physical responses. Your body is perpetually communicating with you. When you feel a desperate urge to justify your actions, your system is likely seeking external validation. When you feel a sudden rise in tension, your biological alarms are detecting a perceived threat. If you find yourself completely exhausted after a brief interaction, it is a sign that your body has performed a level of emotional labor that your conscious mind has yet to acknowledge. Ignoring these internal signals leads to a state of chronic confusion, whereas honoring them builds a foundation of clarity. Hence, we find that body language functions not as a set of instructions, but as a continuous stream of feedback. One of the most influential abilities you can cultivate is the capacity to remain physically relaxed while witnessing tension in another person. When you refuse to mirror the anxiety of those around you, the emotional atmosphere often stabilizes, and conversations naturally decelerate. In this state of calm, people often reveal their true nature more authentically than they would under pressure. Another essential principle to understand is that the body reveals the amount of effort being expended. When someone is comfortable being their authentic self, there is very little strain in their physical presentation. However, when an individual is meticulously managing the impression they make, the effort becomes visible through exaggerated facial expressions, a stiffly controlled posture, or a forced smile. This exertion is not necessarily a sign of dishonesty. It is often an indicator of a fear of being seen. Authentic social intelligence respects this vulnerability. You do not aggressively expose or accuse, but rather observe and recalibrate your boundaries. Sometimes, the most intelligent course of action is to internally disengage and stop investing your vital energy in environments where psychological safety is clearly absent. Consequently, as you begin to trust these internal indicators, your reliance on verbal confirmation diminishes. You learn to recognize when a situation feels off, and you honor that intuition without creating unnecessary conflict. Over time, this practice fundamentally reshapes how you interact with the world. You become less prone to impulsive reactions, more rooted in your own reality, and increasingly selective about your associations. This shift does not occur because you have developed a distrust of humanity, but because you have developed a profound trust in yourself. When that self-trust is established, the nuances of body language lose their mystery. They stop appearing as a complex puzzle and revert to what they have always been, a quiet, honest dialogue occurring beneath the surface of spoken words. Learning to listen to this silent language is not about attaining power over others. It is about reclaiming a deeper level of awareness that has always been available to you, simply waiting for your focused attention. Within the fourth chapter, we investigate the profound reality that while a person's character is visible during periods of tranquility, their true essence is unveiled the moment that peace is interrupted. Emotional triggers are far from coincidental. They function as psychological pressure points where the curated narrative in individual projects begins to fracture. When these points are activated, the internal engine of preservation surges to the forefront, and raw instinct overrides conscious intention. It is during these brief lapses in composure that the truth of a person's internal world leaks out. A trigger is not merely an expression of frustration or sorrow, it is a sudden collapse of emotional governance. Whether provoked by a question, a boundary, a perceived slight, or a simple delay, the reaction is fundamentally disproportionate to the cause. The vocal tone sharpens, the physical form contracts, and the interaction shifts from a collaborative dialogue into a rigid defense. While most people instinctively look away from these uncomfortable moments, social intelligence does the opposite. It leans in with a quiet, observational focus. By witnessing these surges, you discover exactly what an individual is shielding. Those who resort to hostility are often guarding their perceived authority, while those who retreat into a victim persona may be protecting a fragile sense of self-worth. Furthermore, it is essential to recognize that while triggers feel spontaneous, they are remarkably predictable. By paying close attention to what consistently activates an individual, whether it is being interrogated, overlooked, denied, or corrected, distinct patterns inevitably emerge. A person who finds disagreement intolerable is not typically defending an objective truth. Rather, they are protecting their sense of control. Similarly, a strong negative reaction to established boundaries reveals the underlying sense of entitlement. And a person who erupts over minor inconveniences is providing a clear demonstration of their limited emotional bandwidth. The most frequent error in social dynamics is responding emotionally to another person's activation. By arguing, over-apologizing, or retreating in confusion, you attempt to regulate an internal state that is not your responsibility. Authentic social wisdom requires a high degree of emotional restraint. You do not need to resolve someone else's trigger to understand its source, nor do you need to emerge victorious in an argument to see the reality of the situation. Often, the most enlightening response is a complete lack of reaction. By remaining anchored while another person is adrift in an emotional surge, you safeguard your own internal peace and force the other individual to confront their behavior without the distraction of your participation. Hence, we find that these moments of activation serve as a primary indicator of emotional maturity. A sophisticated individual may still experience triggers, but they possess the capacity to recover, reflect, and accept accountability for their actions. In contrast, an emotionally underdeveloped person becomes entirely consumed by the surge, projecting blame onto others and altering the narrative to bypass responsibility. It is vital to understand that you cannot rationalize with someone in the midst of this state. Attempting to do so only serves to entangle you further in their chaos. Another critical realization is that people are often most intensely triggered by behaviors that mirror unresolved conflicts within themselves. They react with volatility toward qualities they refuse to acknowledge in their own character, making them hypersensitive to specific themes. This explains why certain criticisms feel unnecessarily heavy. The resonance of the remark matters far more than its literal content. Grasping this reality prevents you from internalizing reactions that were never fundamentally about you. Consequently, your perception of social friction begins to shift. You realize that a sharp comment or a sudden withdrawal is often a reflection of the other person's internal fragility, or their fear of intimacy rather than a result of your own actions. You no longer need to speculate on the why. You simply need to observe the recurring pattern. One of the most powerful boundaries you can establish is the refusal to engage in debate with an individual who is currently emotionally hijacked. In such a state, the nervous system is incapable of processing logic or achieving clarity because it is entirely focused on defense. Choosing to wait for the storm to pass is not an act of surrender. It is a strategic manifestation of intelligence that preserves your energy and maintains your authority. By refusing to argue with an irrational state, you remain the most grounded person in the room, which is the ultimate position of influence. Triggers also serve as profound mirrors for your own internal state. When an individual's volatile reaction ignites a fire within you, it indicates that a part of your own psyche is demanding attention. Your desperate urge to justify your actions, your longing to be understood, or your terror of being misjudged are just as revealing as the behavior of the other person. Authenticity in social intelligence is not defined by being entirely immune to triggers, but by possessing the self-awareness to recognize them as they occur. This awareness provides the luxury of choice, whereas a lack of it forces you into a subconscious cycle of matching intensity with intensity and defense with defense. By choosing to pause, you activate a powerful tool that allows you to evaluate whether a dialogue is safe, constructive, or even worthy of your mental energy. You begin to realize that not every emotional surge is an invitation to engage. Some are warnings of incompatibility. Some are disclosures of deep-seated issues, and others are clear exit signs. Developing this discernment prevents you from lingering in dynamics that deplete your spirit. It also fosters a deeper sense of empathy that does not require self-betrayal. You can acknowledge that others are operating out of pain or insecurity without feeling obligated to endure their behavior. This equilibrium, maintaining clarity while upholding strict boundaries, is the core of interpersonal wisdom. The objective is not to navigate every provocation perfectly, but to ensure you are no longer governed by these emotional storms. As you learn to witness these surges without reacting, you gain a quiet emotional authority. This steadiness makes you harder to provoke and easier to trust, allowing the true nature of those around you to reveal itself naturally. Hence, we transition into the study of social masks and the inevitable roles that individuals adopt. Every person you encounter is engaged in a form of performance, not necessarily out of a desire to deceive, but as a fundamental human adaptation. From our earliest years, we learn which aspects of our personality are validated and which are dismissed or penalized. Consequently, we recalibrate, emphasizing specific traits while suppressing others to create a persona that ensures our survival within a given environment. This social mask is a protective adaptation, yet complications arise when the mask is mistaken for the true self. Most individuals are oblivious to the roles they inhabit, slipping into them automatically in professional, personal, or public spheres without calculating the immense energy required for their upkeep. One individual might adopt the persona of the competent professional, another the agreeable companion, while others might become the indomitable leader or the silent observer. Each role serves a specific utility. Competence garners admiration, niceness circumvents friction, strength conceals fragility, and silence prevents scrutiny. However, each role exacts a cost. The more inflexible the mask, the less freedom the individual has to act with genuine authenticity. Furthermore, this very rigidity serves as one of the most transparent indicators of psychological insecurity. A functional social mask is pliable. It recalibrates based on the environment and relaxes in the presence of safety. In contrast, a dysfunctional mask is fragile and must be defended at all costs, as it cannot withstand the slightest challenge. When you witness an individual lashing out or retreating the moment their social role is questioned, you are seeing their terror rather than their character. They are frantically guarding the psychological scaffolding that keeps them upright. This explains why questioning a competent person's methods can trigger extreme hostility, or why asking for a nice person's unvarnished opinion creates visible distress. The mask is not merely a facade for the public, it is the lens through which they view themselves, and its removal leaves them feeling dangerously exposed. Sophisticated social intelligence does not seek to strip these masks away. Instead, it observes how desperately an individual clings to them. You must pay attention to the level of exertion involved. When someone is at peace within their role, there is an inherent ease in their presence. When they fear its collapse, you will notice overperformance, excessive explanation, and an obsessive need for control, all of which are symptoms of maintenance rather than authentic confidence. An additional, more nuanced indicator is the way an individual responds when their specific social function is no longer required. The habitual caregiver often feels a sense of disorientation when their help is refused. The high achiever experiences a hollow emptiness when they cease to produce. And the person who prides themselves on strength feels a sudden invisibility when forced to acknowledge a vulnerability. These roles essentially become psychological prisons the moment they supersede self-reflection. Grasping this reality prevents a pervasive error, the act of seeking profound depth from a mere facade. You might find yourself waiting for a moment of vulnerability from someone whose entire survival strategy is rooted in control, or searching for unvarnished honesty from an individual who lives for external approval. Such expectations lead to inevitable disappointment, not necessarily because the other person is acting out of malice, but because they are fundamentally constrained by their own internal architecture. Sophisticated social intelligence recalibrates your expectations to match reality, allowing you to engage with people as they are without sacrificing your own integrity. A vital skill in this domain is identifying who an individual becomes under intense pressure. When the environment grows stressful, do they resort to micromanagement, become overly agreeable, retreat into silence, or display aggression? Stress uncovers which specific mask is performing the heavy lifting. This data is priceless. It informs you of the potential for emotional safety, how future conflicts will likely be navigated, and the true extent of the responsibility that person is capable of assuming. Furthermore, individuals often gravitate toward those whose social masks complement their own. The indomitable figure is frequently drawn to the dependent, the rescuer seeks out the wounded, and the silent observer attracts the highly expressive. While these dynamics may initially feel harmonious, they often become dangerously unbalanced if left unexamined. You may find yourself perpetually recalibrating your own behavior, shrinking your presence, performing a specific character, or overcompensating for another's deficiencies, without even realizing it. Interpersonal wisdom restores this symmetry by helping you notice when you are being coerced into a role you did not consciously choose. It prompts you to ask, who am I transforming into within this specific dynamic? If the answer reveals a sense of constriction or falseness, the connection is misaligned. This realization is not a tool for blaming others, but a mechanism for safeguarding your own authenticity. It is also important to note that social masks are not inherently negative. We require various roles to function within the structures of society. The hazard lies in unconscious identification. When a person is unable to step outside their persona, they lose the capacity for self-observation and begin to confuse a threat to their role with a threat to their very worth. This is the catalyst for unnecessary escalation. The socially intelligent response is one of anchored clarity. You do not debate with the mask or attempt to prove your point to a protective structure. You recognize that you are not communicating with a liberated self, but with a defense mechanism, which often necessitates setting firm boundaries or simply disengaging. Hence, we must also turn this analytical gaze inward to examine our own protective layers. We must identify the persona we adopt to be liked, the one we use to command respect, and the one we utilize to avoid the sting of rejection. Asking yourself who you become when you feel threatened deepens your social intelligence more effectively than any external tactic, because the moment you recognize your own mask, its grip begins to loosen. As your own performance fades, you become remarkably less reactive to the behavior of others, less intimidated by those who seek dominance, and less seduced by the allure of superficial approval. You cease mistaking a performance for the truth, and in that lucidity, relationships become significantly simpler. They may not become easier, but they certainly become clearer. You know exactly what you are interacting with and, more importantly, what you are not. This discernment is not a sign of coldness, but a hallmark of emotional maturity. Authentic connection does not demand the total absence of social masks. It requires a conscious awareness of them. This awareness is the gateway to choice, allowing you to reclaim your presence regardless of the role standing in front of you. Consequently, we enter the study of power dynamics within the rhythm of daily discourse. Influence is one of the most frequently misinterpreted forces in human society, often equated with being the loudest, the most intelligent, or the most aggressive figure in the room. However, authentic power is rarely ostentatious. It does not announce itself with fanfare, but instead settles quietly into the space between individuals, shaping the trajectory of every exchange. True influence is not found in the control of others, but in the absolute governance of oneself. Within any interaction, the individual who requires the least amount of external validation inherently holds the greatest amount of leverage. This is why power dynamics often feel subtle yet undeniable. Even in total silence, you can sense who is leading the narrative, who is making the adjustments, and who is merely reacting to the emotional field. The hierarchy reveals itself not through titles, but through the steadiness of one's presence. Influence is profoundly expressed through the cadence of engagement. The individual who dictates the tempo of an interaction frequently establishes its ultimate path. An individual who articulates their thoughts deliberately, utilizing comfortable pauses and allowing for moments of stillness, rarely suffers from the apprehension of being misconstrued. Conversely, those who speak with urgency, fill every void with noise, or resort to interruptions are often grappling with significant internal strain. Within this context, silence is never merely a vacuum, it is a potent indicator. Those who find quiet moments intolerable often betray a deep-seated requirement for validation, recognition, or a sense of dominance. In contrast, the capacity to inhabit silence without psychological friction communicates an inherent stability. This does not imply that every quiet moment is a sign of strength, but rather that unforced stillness serves as a hallmark of composure. Another reliable measure of influence is the degree of reactivity an individual displays. The more reactive a person becomes, the less genuine authority they possess in that moment. When a person descends into defensiveness or becomes emotionally volatile, their internal state has effectively been compromised. Their attention is no longer unencumbered. They are merely reacting to stimuli rather than exercising a conscious choice. True authority belongs to the individual who remains anchored when their perspective is interrogated, which is why the governance of one's emotions serves as the bedrock of interpersonal wisdom. One can be intellectually gifted and charismatic, yet still forfeit their influence if their emotions are easily manipulated by external forces. Frequently, people surrender their leverage by providing excessive justifications for their actions, clarifying and repeating themselves not because of a lack of comprehension from others, but because of their own desperate need to be validated. In these instances, they transition from a state of presence to one of persuasion. While presence represents authentic power, persuasion is often a form of compensation for its absence. Furthermore, we must consider the subtle mechanics of frame control. The frame represents the unspoken parameters that define the central theme and values of any given conversation. It dictates who identifies the core issue, who determines what remains relevant, and who establishes the prevailing emotional climate. The individual who commands the frame does not need to argue for its validity, they simply embody it. If someone successfully draws you into a defensive posture, they have effectively seized control of the frame. If you remain centered while another person's volatility escalates, you have successfully retained it. Influence is not achieved through the act of overpowering others, but is preserved by refusing to be displaced from your own reality. This explains why a calm demeanor can be so unsettling to those who rely on conflict. They require your emotional involvement to maintain their own sense of order. When you refuse to participate in their turbulence, the entire dynamic is transformed, and you are no longer fulfilling the role they have projected onto you. It is also vital to recognize that power is a relational force rather than an absolute one. Its presence fluctuates depending on the environment, the context, and the level of emotional investment. The more deeply you are tethered to a specific outcome, the more leverage you risk surrendering. This does not suggest a path of cold detachment, but rather one of heightened awareness. If your self-regard is contingent upon winning a social exchange, you have already compromised your position. Interpersonal wisdom involves discerning the difference between what is truly significant and what is merely a provocation. Not every inquiry demands an answer, not every error requires an immediate correction, and not every instance of friction needs a resolution. Often, the most influential maneuver is the exercise of restraint, a choice that is frequently mislabeled as passivity, but is actually a form of selective and strategic engagement. Hence, we find that power dynamics also encompass the concept of emotional containment. Certain individuals unconsciously project their own anxieties, frustrations, or insecurities onto those around them, provoking reactions as a means of relieving their own internal pressure. If you absorb this energy, you become the vessel for their instability, and the balance of influence shifts in their favor. However, the moment you cease performing this emotional labor, the hierarchy is reset. You do not mirror their agitation, nor do you rush to provide comfort or match their escalation. Instead, you maintain a steady composure. This consistency is not a sign of indifference, but a profound expression of self-respect. Over time, others begin to respond differently to an individual who cannot be easily destabilized. They become more thoughtful, more transparent, or they simply withdraw. All of these outcomes provide essential clarity. These dynamics also serve to highlight the nature of personal boundaries. When you establish a limit calmly and the other party responds with hostility or attempts to induce guilt, they are not reacting to the boundary itself, but to the sudden loss of their perceived control. This reaction provides all the necessary data about their character. A person who respects your autonomy may experience disappointment, but they will eventually recalibrate their behavior, whereas an entitled individual will offer resistance. In such cases, there is no need to debate the validity of your boundary. The reaction of the other person is the only answer you require. The ultimate transformation in commanding influence is internal. you cease equating popularity with security, concurrence with genuine bond, or volatility with passion. You come to understand that a serene authority fosters a deeper level of trust than any exertion of force could ever achieve. This does not imply a desire to dominate the narrative, but rather a commitment to anchoring it. You learn to listen without losing your composure, to articulate your thoughts without imposition, and to withdraw from unproductive exchanges without a trace of bitterness. This is the hallmark of authentic power. It is silent, rooted, and entirely unhurried. Once you inhabit this state, your interactions shift naturally, not through manipulation, but because you have ceased surrendering your internal center. In its most constructive form, power is not something seized from others. It is the refusal to abandon oneself. When this realization takes hold, social intelligence evolves from a mere set of tactics into a fundamental way of existing, making every encounter more transparent, more composed, and more authentic. Hence, we transition into the 7th chapter, the art of deciphering human nature without falling into the trap of bitterness. Gaining the ability to read others can initially feel like an unsettling awakening. You begin to detect discrepancies, hidden agendas, and psychological themes that were once invisible. While this newfound awareness is initially empowering, it can quickly turn into a silent cynicism if one is not cautious. Many who acquire psychological insight too rapidly begin to view all human action through a lens of suspicion, mistaking emotional armor for wisdom. Authentic interpersonal wisdom, however, does not demand that you close your heart. It requires that you refine your discernment while maintaining your empathy. The primary distinction lies in the separation of behavior from character. Conduct is often a product of immediate circumstances, whereas character is a narrative revealed over a duration of time. When these concepts are blurred, you begin to perceive every individual as a threat, shifting from a state of active listening to one of defensive scanning, thereby losing the very presence required for accurate perception. Cynicism is frequently a shield forged from past disappointments, a reaction to seeing the truth too late, or trusting without established boundaries. Yet, perpetual suspicion does not offer protection. It merely offers isolation. Social intelligence advocates for a more balanced path, observing themes without immediately assigning malicious intent and keeping the nervous system regulated enough to remain an accurate witness. Furthermore, it is easy to mistake psychological insight for a sense of moral superiority. The temptation to believe one stands above the common fray is subtle and corrosive, leading to a quiet contempt that blinds you to your own fallibilities. Every individual, including yourself, operates through subconscious patterns. Interpersonal wisdom is not about standing apart from the human condition, but about understanding it from the inside out. A foundational principle to embrace is that awareness does not necessitate agreement. You can comprehend the why behind someone's conduct without providing an excuse for it. You can empathize with their internal state without feeling obligated to participate in it. This equilibrium ensures you remain anchored. One of the most effective methods to circumvent cynicism is to transition from interpretation to pure observation. While interpretation rushes to judge what a behavior means about a person's soul, observation simply asks what is occurring in the present moment. By remaining in a state of observation, you remain curious, allowing you to collect more comprehensive data and notice the presence or absence of consistency. Consequently, you begin to realize that the majority of people are not calculatingly manipulative. Rather, they are defensive, reactive, and navigating their own internal shadows. While this realization does not render their actions harmless, it does acknowledge them as inherently human. Perceiving this humanity softens your internal posture, and that flexibility, when paired with firm boundaries, is where true strength resides. Boundaries are the essential infrastructure that permits compassion to exist without causing personal collapse. Without them, empathy is merely self-sacrifice. With them, it becomes a refined form of discernment. This balance allows you to move through the world with a clear eye and a steady heart, engaging with reality as it is, rather than how you fear it might be. A socially intelligent individual does not demand universal transparency. They recognize that such a state is not attainable for everyone. Rather than forcing a standard, they calibrate their level of intimacy to the other person's actual capacity. They choose to invest deeply with those who exhibit personal accountability, while strategically limiting their openness with those who habitually deflect responsibility. This approach is not an act of retribution, but a necessary alignment with reality. Furthermore, interpreting human nature does not equate to making perfect predictions. It involves the recognition of probabilities. Patterns indicate tendencies rather than absolute certainties. When you demand certainty, your perspective becomes brittle, whereas acknowledging probability allows you to remain adaptable. This flexibility is the key to remaining receptive without being gullible. It permits you to recalibrate your understanding as fresh data emerges. Occasionally, individuals will surprise you in constructive ways, and while cynicism leaves no room for such surprises, authentic clarity does. As your emotional regulation improves, your perceptions become more nuanced. You move away from binary thinking and the urge to categorize individuals as purely good or bad, accepting complexity without the frantic need to resolve it. This acceptance is not a weight to carry, but a form of liberation from false narratives. You no longer require others to be perfectly consistent to understand them, nor do you require external closure to advance. You simply accept what is presented and determine your course of action accordingly. Furthermore, the ultimate protection against a bitter outlook is consistent self-honesty. It is vital to frequently examine whether you are truly observing or merely projecting your own unresolved feelings onto others. Projection is a psychological mechanism for externalizing internal pain, and when you are fatigued or disappointed, your perception will inevitably be colored by those states. Acknowledging this does not indicate fragility, but rather a healthy humanity. This realization restores a sense of humility, which keeps your insights untainted by ego. At its pinnacle, social intelligence does not harden your character, it clarifies it. You become more empathetic without becoming permissive, more perceptive without becoming detached, and more aware without becoming secluded. You perceive others as they truly are and allow that reality to dictate your choices. In doing so, you preserve an essential openness, not the vulnerability of the naive, but the calculated openness of one who sees clearly and still values human connection. This equilibrium is rare, and it is the bridge that transforms psychological insight into genuine wisdom. Hence, we arrive at the 8th chapter, the necessity of mastering oneself as the bedrock of interpersonal wisdom. All previous insights converge on a single, often resisted reality. You cannot achieve a profound understanding of others if you remain detached from your own internal world. Social intelligence does not originate in the observation of others, but in the regulation of oneself. Before you ever attempt to decode behavior or navigate a power dynamic, your nervous system has already filtered your perception of the environment. If you are operating from a place of insecurity or reactivity, your focus narrows. You perceive threats where none exist and internalize actions that were never intended for you. Therefore, self-governance is not a luxury, it is the foundation. Without it, one may acquire psychological knowledge but will only use it as a defensive shield to avoid further hurt, eventually turning wisdom into a form of isolation. Consequently, self-mastery begins with the realization of how your internal state dictates your interpretation of reality. When your emotions are turbulent, you are not truly reading people, you are projecting your past onto the present. Ancient wounds often masquerade as intuition, and familiar anxieties pretend to be insight. While this is a universal human experience, it must be consciously acknowledged. The primary discipline of self-governance is emotional regulation, viewing emotions not as obstacles to be removed, but as data points to be interpreted. The danger arises when these feelings become the drivers of your behavior rather than just information. An individual lacking regulation reacts instantly and only seeks understanding in the aftermath. In contrast, a regulated individual notices the internal surge, identifies it, and deliberately pauses. That pause is the birthplace of freedom within an interaction. Without it, the conversation controls you. Regulation is distinct from suppression. While suppression creates physical rigidity and dulls awareness, true regulation allows an emotion to be felt without permitting it to hijack your conduct. You possess the capacity to experience anger without descending into aggression, to feel apprehension without retreating into avoidance, and to endure hurt without a desperate demand for immediate repair. This ability alone dramatically elevates your interpersonal wisdom. The second discipline involves a profound awareness of boundaries. These are not merely rules you impose on external figures, but limits you honor within your own psyche. Most individuals encounter social friction not because they lack an understanding of others, but because they are disconnected from their own thresholds. They linger in environments too long, provide excessive justifications for their existence, and tolerate discomfort until a bitter resentment replaces their initial clarity. Self-governance demands that you address a challenging inquiry: for what am I truly available, and for what am I not? This is not a question answered once, but a continuous calibration in real time. Personal boundaries become perceptible the moment discomfort arises, as that friction serves as data indicating a misalignment. Disregarding these signals does not make you compassionate, it renders you disconnected from your own core. An individual who has mastered themselves does not rush to pacify discomfort. They inhabit it, listen to its message, and reach a decision. This is the primary method for halting the cycle of emotional overextension. Furthermore, the third discipline is the cultivation of inner clarity, a deep knowledge of your own values, recurring patterns, and emotional inclinations that prevents you from outsourcing your decisions to the whims of others. Without this lucidity, you are prone to overthinking, replaying dialogue in your mind, and searching for external omens. With it, you simply observe and advance. Clarity does not eliminate the inherent uncertainty of life, but it does dissolve confusion. While you may not predict the ultimate outcome of a situation, you possess the certainty of how you will respond. This internal knowledge acts as a stabilizer, reducing emotional dependency. You cease requiring others to validate your perceptions because you have learned to trust your own observations without needing a consensus. This is not a manifestation of arrogance, but a profound expression of self-trust. Hence, another essential facet of self-mastery is the practice of self-observation without the weight of judgment. Most people fluctuate between total denial and harsh self-criticism, either of which fosters genuine growth. Neutral observation is different. You simply notice when you are seeking reassurance, when you are circumventing a difficult dialogue, or when certain personalities cause your internal stability to waver. You do not shame yourself for these occurrences, you merely witness them. This objective awareness creates the necessary space for transformation without the need for force. Self-governance is not the pursuit of perfection, but the pursuit of consciousness. As this awareness deepens, your social interactions undergo subtle yet influential shifts. You stop reacting with urgency, you no longer fill silences with anxiety, and you cease the habit of over-explaining yourself to feel secure. Others instinctively sense this transition. They recognize when an individual is not emotionally needy, not easily provoked, and not attempting to manufacture a specific outcome. Conversations become more composed and dynamics become more transparent. Consequently, self-mastery requires the acceptance of a challenging reality. You possess no authority to regulate the internal states of others. No amount of psychological insight will render another person emotionally available. No degree of patience will mature an individual who evades responsibility, and no depth of understanding will heal someone who rejects self-reflection. Social intelligence does not struggle against this reality, it aligns with it. You cease attempting to extract profound depth from shallow sources, you stop explaining your boundaries to those who are determined to ignore them, and you stop pursuing emotional resolution from unavailable sources. This is not an act of cold detachment, but an act of essential alignment. The final layer of self-governance is the acceptance of your own emotional limits and the varying capacities of those around you. You accept that clarity does not always guarantee comfort. You may perceive a situation perfectly and still experience loneliness, or establish a boundary and still feel misjudged. Self-mastery does not erase these emotions, but it prevents them from leading to self-abandonment. This is the very heart of interpersonal wisdom, not the perfect reading of others or the control of interactions, but the ability to remain whole within them. When you are anchored in yourself, you no longer enter a room seeking validation or safety. You enter grounded, listening without losing your center, speaking without a defensive posture, and departing without a trace of resentment. This internal stability is the anchor from which everything else you have learned becomes a natural expression of your character. Ultimately, the most socially intelligent person is not the one who deciphered everyone else, but the one who understood themselves so deeply that they could no longer be easily disoriented. As this exploration reaches its conclusion, it is essential to revisit the fundamental inquiry that has threaded through every section. What is the actual transformation that occurs when you grasp the essence of human conduct, not merely as a theoretical exercise, but as a practical, lived reality? The ultimate reward is not a sense of control, but a profound state of liberation. When you develop the ability to perceive others with absolute clarity, you cease squandering your vital energy in a struggle against the facts of reality. You stop debating with behavioral patterns that have already manifested themselves and stop pursuing honesty from sources that are either incapable of or unwilling to provide it. This level of lucidity simplifies the architecture of your life. You no longer feel the psychological weight of decoding every interaction or replaying dialogue in search of obscured meanings. You cease the error of mistaking emotional volatility for truth or long-term familiarity for genuine safety. Instead, you simply observe. You notice how individuals function under duress, what they habitually shield or circumvent, and how your own internal system responds to their presence. Most importantly, you learn to trust that internal signal as a primary source of data. Furthermore, this heightened awareness does not foster a sense of cold detachment. Rather, it makes you fundamentally rooted. This grounding allows you to participate in the world without the risk of losing your core identity. One of the most significant transitions born from interpersonal wisdom is the cessation of the need to be understood by everyone. You come to realize that a lack of mutual understanding is not always a failure of your communication skills. Frequently, it is a reflection of the other person's limited psychological capacity. Once this is accepted, the habits of over-explaining, over-giving, and overextending begin to fade. You meet others where they truly stand without ever abandoning your own position. This is not a form of indifference, but a profound manifestation of self-respect. A quiet internal shift occurs where you stop interpreting the behavior of others as a personal verdict on your value. An individual's coldness no longer dictates your worth, their defensiveness no longer destabilizes your equilibrium, and their inconsistency no longer traps you in a cycle of self-doubt. You begin to perceive behavior as neutral information rather than a personal accusation, a shift that enables compassion without emotional collapse and connection without self-betrayal. Consequently, you become increasingly selective with your associations, not out of a sense of distrust, but because you have learned to value your own energy. Interpersonal wisdom is not defined by engaging more frequently, it is defined by engaging with greater discernment. You learn to identify the moments where silence is more articulate than speech, when to move closer and when to retreat, and when to seek clarification versus accepting what has already been demonstrated. These choices do not diminish your life. They refine it, allowing relationships to either deepen authentically or dissolve naturally without the use of force. Another evident truth is the realization that you cannot liberate others from their own recurring patterns. You can only safeguard yourself from being ensnared by them. This perspective is not harsh, it is liberating. It removes the perceived obligation to rescue, fix, or prove yourself to others, returning personal responsibility to its rightful owner. In relinquishing this burden, you reclaim your presence. Hence, we find that presence is the authentic currency of social intelligence. When you are truly present, you possess the capacity to listen intently without absorbing the surrounding chaos. You respond with deliberation rather than through impulse. You remain emotionally accessible without being dangerously exposed. Presence allows for the rare and powerful balance of being simultaneously open and protected. While most individuals oscillate between the extremes of gullibility and cynicism, or overexposure and total withdrawal, social intelligence offers a middle path, lucidity paired with warmth, and boundaries maintained with compassion. You do not become a harder person, you become a steadier one. This steadiness fundamentally alters how the world interacts with you. People instinctively sense when an individual is not easily manipulated, not starving for validation, and not intimidated by silence. Some will be inspired to match that stability, while others will naturally drift away, Both outcomes are honest, and that honesty is the very goal you were pursuing. Finally, as you move forward, keep in mind that deciphering human nature is not about outmaneuvering others. It is about ensuring you are no longer disoriented by them. It involves honoring your perceptions and choosing the appropriate distance to stand from any given person. Interpersonal wisdom does not promise a life of perfect relationships, but it does guarantee clear ones, transparent enough to depart from what diminishes you and healthy enough to invest in what nourishes your spirit. Perhaps the most vital realization of all is that the more clearly you perceive others, the more gently you begin to view yourself. You find the grace to forgive your previous misunderstandings and acknowledge your past blind spots. Instead of shame, you experience a sense of relief, because you understand that clarity is not an act of condemnation, but one of comprehension.